1497, a seemingly modest expedition left the shores of a small island kingdom, its flag raised against the vast expanse of the North Atlantic. The captain, John Cabot, guided his ship toward the unknown waters of the New World, unaware that his voyage would lay the first claim to what would, in time, become the greatest empire the world had ever seen. Behind him, England was little more than a fragmented island power, far removed from the global stage dominated by the might of Spain, Portugal, and France. Yet, in just a few centuries, this unassuming kingdom would come to govern a quarter of the world's land and people. The story of the British Empire is not one of grand design, nor of calculated conquest from the start. It was instead an empire born out of opportunism, ambition, and a seemingly unremarkable series of events that would, by sheer will and circumstance, carve a legacy of both extraordinary achievement and profound consequences. It was a tale of sailors and soldiers, of merchants and pirates, of wealth and violence, each piece of the story contributing to the vast and complex fabric of British dominance. For some, the empire evokes visions of progress, railways stretching across continents, the spread of parliamentary systems, the construction of courts and schools that endure to this day. But for others, it is a painful reminder of displacement, exploitation, and cultural disruption, the scars of which remain long after the empire's fall. The empire's rise was not inevitable. It was not the result of a preordained plan, nor was it a singular moment of brilliance. It was, in essence, a series of small, fragmented steps, each taking place on a different continent, in different eras, all culminating in a sprawling empire that changed the face of the world. In the early days, merchants ventured into unknown waters, spurred by trade and profit. These voyages, driven by private enterprise rather than royal mandates, would set the stage for the imperial project to come. A small, ambitious nation, perched on the edge of Europe, would soon find itself at the helm of an empire that spanned oceans and continents. But the British Empire, much like the rise of any great power, was not without its dark side. The riches accumulated from far-flung colonies often came at the cost of human lives. Enslaved men and women, displaced communities, and entire cultures erased in the wake of imperial conquest. Yet, despite these undeniable truths, the empire left a mark on the world that can still be seen today. English is spoken across continents. Legal systems and democratic institutions built on British foundations are found from the Americas to Africa, and the legacy of its colonial past is a part of the global fabric. This story of the British Empire, sprawling across centuries and continents, is not just one of power. It is a complex narrative of both triumph and tragedy, achievement and exploitation, glory and pain. The foundations of this empire began not with conquest, but with commerce, a humble beginning that would reshape the world in ways few could have foreseen. The journey of Britain's empire is a tale of unexpected rise, of merchants turned governors, of privateers who became heroes, and of explorers who claimed new worlds in the name of a kingdom. The British Empire was not crafted by the will of one monarch or one vision, but by the ambition of individuals, the thirst for profit, and the relentless march of history. And so, the story begins, not with the grandeur of kings and queens, but with a simple voyage across the sea, setting into motion an empire that would forever change the course of human history. A tale of rise, fall, and legacy. This is the story of the British Empire. Hey there, I'm glad you're here. In today's video, I'll take you through the timeline of the story of the British Empire, starting from its humble beginnings, with John Cabot's voyage in 1497, then moving through the rise of trade, the creation of the East India Company, and the dramatic expansion under the Victorian era. We'll also explore the empire's eventual decline and its lasting legacy in the modern world. Comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button to stay updated with more exciting content. And if you're not subscribing, we'd love to hear why in the comments. We really appreciate your feedback. In the spring of 1497, as the Atlantic Ocean stretched vast and uncharted before him, John Cabot, an Italian explorer working under the commission of King Henry VII of England, set sail from the port of Bristol. The goal was ambitious, though shrouded in uncertainty. Cabot, a man of vision and hope, had been tasked with finding a westward route to Asia. The allure of spices, silk, and unimaginable wealth promised by the East had driven the great navigators of the age. But Cabot's destination was not Asia, and the riches he sought would remain elusive. Instead, he would become the first Englishman to set foot on the shores of North America, Newfoundland, to be exact, a name that would mean little in the grand scheme of global power at the time. But here's where the story becomes fascinating. England, at that very moment, was not a great maritime power. In fact, it was a kingdom with a relatively modest presence in the world. While Spain and Portugal had already staked their claim on the New World, sending massive fleets to conquer vast swaths of land, England's ambitions were still wrapped in a thin thread of naval pride. The Tudor monarchy, having risen out of the ashes of the Wars of the Roses, was just beginning to establish its foothold on the European stage. The kingdom, surrounded by rivals, had little reason to believe it could compete with the oceanic dominance of its Iberian neighbors. The geographical advantages of England were, on the surface, undistinguished in comparison to the established maritime powers. Unlike Spain or Portugal, which had already mastered the winds and waves of the Atlantic, England's navy was still in its infancy. The island, no point further than 70 miles from the coast, was a convenient starting point for voyagers, but it had never been more than a peripheral player in the race for global dominance. For much of the 15th century, England had turned inward, focused on consolidating its own fragile political stability. The royal ambitions under King Henry VII, the first Tudor monarch, were simple: secure the throne, restore peace, and maintain the realm's sovereignty. Foreign expansion, much less empire building, was far from his mind. England was not prepared to rival Spain's exploration of the Americas or Portugal's maritime advancements around Africa. The nation's focus, then, was largely on internal consolidation and European diplomacy. Henry's reign was characterized by a cautious approach to foreign policy, an understandable stance for a kingdom that had been torn apart by civil war. So when John Cabot set sail in 1497, it was less about empire building and more about fulfilling a modest royal commission. The idea of staking England's claim on the riches of the world was not yet a national obsession. Instead, Cabot was sent out to explore the possibility of a trade route, one that could offer England a piece of the burgeoning spice trade, a trade that had been monopolized by the Iberian powers since the 15th century. Henry VII, himself somewhat isolated from the great currents of European exploration, saw in Cabot's mission a potential gain, but one that was not yet tied to any grand imperial vision. But here's where history intervenes. What began as a modest, almost cautious endeavor would unexpectedly lay the first stone in the construction of what would become one of the most powerful empires the world would ever know. Cabot's discovery of Newfoundland marked the first English claim in North America, a claim that would remain dormant for decades, yet would eventually fuel England's thirst for empire. The potential of new lands, the possibility of untapped resources, and the distant allure of the East all began to stir in the hearts of the English, particularly as the century wore on and the realities of global competition came to bear. While Cabot's voyage itself was unremarkable in its immediate results, he did not find a direct route to the east, nor did he secure riches. It provided the crucial first step in a series of events that would snowball into one of the most dramatic shifts in world history. For England, this seemingly inconsequential journey was a spark that would light the fire of empire. Cabot's claim in Newfoundland would eventually transform from a footnote in maritime exploration to a launchpad for England's later colonial expansion. The world in 1497 did not know it yet, but a future empire was quietly taking root. The seeds of an empire, fueled by trade, exploration, and the relentless pursuit of profit, had been planted, and over the next few centuries, England would grow from a modest island kingdom to a global superpower, its reach extending across oceans, continents, and cultures. But as Cabot's ship made its way back to England, unaware of the monumental role it had just played, the true scale of what was to come remained hidden. This was no immediate conquest, nor a simple mission of trade. It was the beginning of something far greater, a journey toward a new world order, and the eventual rise of the British Empire. Little did the world know that this seemingly small expedition would one day lay the foundation for the largest empire the world had ever seen. The Tudor dynasty, despite its relatively recent ascent to power in 1485, would come to define an era of profound transformation for England. At the heart of this transformation lay the reign of Henry VII, a monarch whose rise to power had been defined by the end of England's bloody Wars of the Roses. Having secured his throne through a decisive victory at the Battle of Bosworth Field, Henry's focus was initially centered on consolidating power, securing the throne for his bloodline, and healing the internal wounds of the kingdom. But even as England's monarch, Henry's ambitions were far from grand in the early years of his reign. At this juncture, England's place in the world was modest at best. The kingdom was not a major player on the European stage. Far from the glittering dynasties of France and Spain, England was still recovering from decades of internal turmoil, its economy largely dependent on trade with Europe, especially with Flanders, and its geopolitical strategy defined by careful diplomacy rather than overt expansion. For much of the 15th century, England had been content to remain a peripheral force on the continent, outmatched by Spain and Portugal, two maritime giants that were already making their mark in distant lands. But, as history would reveal, Henry VII's pragmatism and foresight would lay the groundwork for England's rise, and it began with an unlikely yet pivotal alliance. In 1373, long before the Tudors came to power, England and Portugal had signed the Treaty of London, a diplomatic agreement that would set the stage for England's first step into the world of overseas exploration. Though the treaty was primarily focused on trade relations, it had far-reaching consequences for England's maritime ambitions. At the time, Portugal was not merely a nation on the rise, it was an emerging maritime superpower. The Portuguese had already mastered the art of navigation, carving new paths around Africa to India, and securing lucrative trade routes to Asia. Their wealth from these routes, and their expertise in shipbuilding, cartography, and navigation made them one of the most advanced seafaring nations of the time. The Treaty of London granted English merchants access to Portuguese ports, and, perhaps most importantly, their vast navigational knowledge. This was no minor detail. The Portuguese had pioneered advanced sailing techniques using the caravel, a revolutionary ship design that allowed for longer voyages and greater maneuverability on the high seas. They had also perfected the use of astrolabes and portolan charts, enabling them to chart previously unknown waters with remarkable accuracy. England, at this point, was still a relatively backward nation in terms of maritime prowess, lacking the infrastructure and knowledge of Spain and Portugal. But through this treaty, England gained critical access to the tools of exploration, which would fuel future ventures into the uncharted territories of the world. It was an arrangement that, at first glance, may have seemed more commercial than imperial, but it laid the groundwork for what would come. English merchants, now able to access Portuguese routes, would venture into Africa, India, and beyond, slowly but steadily growing England's presence in global trade. But more importantly, it set a precedent, a recognition that England could, with the right resources and knowledge, participate in the growing competition for global dominance. In many ways, this partnership represented a quiet turning point. While Spain and Portugal were already deeply entrenched in the age of exploration, England had been a latecomer to the game. The Treaty of London was less about immediate empire building and more about England finding its footing in a rapidly changing world. Yet, the ambitions ignited by this agreement would soon evolve into something much more audacious. Henry VII, ever the cautious monarch, may not have anticipated it at the time, but the seeds of empire had been planted. As tensions built in Europe and other powers aggressively staked their claims on new lands, little did they know that this alliance, a small and unassuming act in the grand scheme of things, would eventually propel England into a race for global dominance. The reign of Henry VII, though defined by careful consolidation of power within England's borders, marked the first tentative steps towards what would eventually become the British Empire. Having ascended to the throne following the tumultuous Wars of the Roses, Henry's political strategy was one of survival and stability. His kingdom was fractured by years of civil strife, and his primary concern was securing the monarchy. He sought to avoid the violent missteps of his predecessors, focusing on creating alliances, both within England and with the European powers that had historically overshadowed his realm. The House of Tudor, newly established and fragile, had to be careful not to overextend itself, especially when contending with more powerful neighbors like Spain and France. However, even in the midst of this cautious reign, there existed a subtle, underlying recognition. England's future did not lie solely within the confines of its island. As the 15th century turned into the 16th, the winds of exploration were beginning to stir across Europe. While Spain and Portugal were the undisputed maritime powers, with Columbus's successful discovery of the Americas in 1492 and Vasco da Gama's sea route to India, opening new trade horizons, England stood on the periphery, hesitant but not entirely passive. Henry VII, whose foreign policy was characterized by calculated diplomacy, could not ignore the growing influence of exploration, particularly when it came to securing new trade routes and expanding England's economic future. In this context, Henry sought a practical way to engage with the growing global competition. Instead of following Spain and Portugal's model of aggressive territorial conquest, he decided on a more modest venture. Henry VII was aware that England's resources were limited, and its naval capabilities were far inferior to those of its rivals. Instead of sending grand expeditions to the Americas, Henry opted to commission an explorer who could offer England a path forward, one grounded in trade rather than immediate territorial expansion. This decision led him to the Italian-born navigator John Cabot, who, though not widely known at the time, would go on to make a discovery that would quietly lay the groundwork for England's future empire. Cabot, in 1497, embarked on a mission not to conquer, but to explore. His primary goal was to find a northwest passage to Asia, a route that could open up new opportunities for English merchants to access the fabled wealth of the East. The Portuguese had already navigated the African coast and entered the Indian Ocean, while Spain had made its own bold conquests in the Americas. Cabot's expedition, backed by Henry VII, was England's entry into this global race, but it was more a tentative toe in the water than a full-fledged plunge. As Cabot set sail westward from Bristol, he was aware of the ambitions of his competitors. Like Columbus, Cabot sought riches, but instead of gold, it was the promise of spices, silks, and trading routes that drove him. His voyage, however, would yield neither the riches he hoped for, nor the road to Asia that had been dreamed of by many before him. Instead, Cabot reached the shores of Newfoundland, a place that, at the time, seemed no more than a distant land on the edge of the known world. Yet, what Cabot had stumbled upon, though lacking the immediate wealth of gold, was far from insignificant. The Newfoundland fishing grounds turned out to be a treasure trove of resources that would go on to become the economic backbone of early English exploration and settlement in the Americas. The abundant cod in the North Atlantic, a highly valuable commodity, offered England a way into the global market without the need for the immediate conquest of land or empires. This discovery, focused on the lucrative fishing industry, would set the stage for future ventures, creating a lasting English presence in the Americas, albeit for commercial purposes rather than imperial conquest. In this sense, Cabot's 1497 voyage was not the grand success of immediate riches, but it was nonetheless a turning point. England had not struck gold, nor had it found a shortcut to the riches of the East, but Cabot's voyage placed England on the map of global exploration. It marked the first of many English ventures into the New World and laid the foundation for a future that would be built on commerce rather than sheer conquest. England's future in the Americas would be shaped not by its ability to claim vast empires, but by its ability to exploit the resources of the New World through fishing, trade, and eventually settlement. Cabot's voyage to Newfoundland, though it did not immediately yield the fabled treasures of the East, opened a new chapter for England's maritime presence in the Americas. It was the beginning of an economic and strategic foothold that would grow into something much larger over the coming centuries. But while the search for gold in the New World failed, what Cabot stumbled upon would quietly build England's presence in the Americas, setting the stage for the future. In the early 1530s, England found itself at a pivotal crossroads, a moment when religion and politics would merge to irrevocably alter the kingdom's future. At the heart of this transformation was Henry VIII, a monarch whose actions would change the very fabric of England's relationship with the rest of the world. Henry, a man of immense personal ambition and powerful convictions, was, at his core, a ruler who sought control over his throne, control over his church, and control over England's future. But his fateful break with the Roman Catholic Church would not only change the religious direction of the kingdom, it would reshape England's standing in Europe and beyond. The English Reformation, born out of Henry's desire for a male heir and his frustration with the Pope's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, set in motion a series of events that had profound international consequences. At the heart of this break was Henry's insistence that his authority as king superseded the Pope's and his desire to ensure his legacy through the establishment of a male heir. But the decision was more than personal, it was deeply political. By severing ties with the Catholic Church, Henry VIII created a new church, the Church of England, with the monarch at its head. This was no mere religious schism. It was a declaration of sovereignty, a declaration that England, though small and often overlooked in the grand scheme of European power, would carve out its own path. At the time, Catholicism had been the dominant force in European politics for centuries. The Pope held sway over monarchs, and the religious unity of Europe was seen as crucial to maintaining political stability. Henry's split from the Catholic Church sent shockwaves through Europe, and England's rejection of Rome would have serious repercussions. The immediate effect was alienation. Henry's actions pushed England to the margins of Europe's religious world, while Spain, Portugal, and France remained loyal to Catholicism. England stood alone. Its ties with Catholic powers weakened. The political fallout was profound. Pope Clement VII, incensed by Henry's refusal to accept papal authority, excommunicated the English king, severing not just religious ties, but also any diplomatic and political bonds that had once existed. The Catholic monarchs of Europe, especially Charles V of Spain, Catherine's nephew, viewed Henry's actions as a direct challenge to the traditional order of Christendom. For a kingdom like England, once reliant on Catholic alliances, this split made it vulnerable to hostile action from the more powerful Catholic states, who now saw England as a dangerous outlier. But there was a deeper, more complicated dimension to Henry's actions. While his break with Rome isolated him, it also made England more self-reliant. The creation of the Church of England not only gave Henry religious control, but also political independence, freedom that would later allow England to pursue its own interests, unimpeded by the religious dictates of Rome. It was an act that fundamentally altered England's future trajectory, pushing it into the arms of Protestant nations and altering its course in the emerging European religious wars. Henry VIII, though deeply religious himself, began to look more toward Protestant rulers in Germany and Scandinavia as natural allies, shifting the kingdom's foreign policy focus and creating opportunities for trade and military alliances that were previously unthinkable. In the aftermath of the Reformation, England's relationship with Catholic Europe became increasingly strained. The former allies, Spain, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, now viewed England with suspicion and hostility. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, and Francis I of France would both attempt to undermine Henry's rule using diplomatic pressure, military tactics, and religious campaigns. While England had managed to secure its independence from Rome, it was now vulnerable to a new set of geopolitical challenges as its former allies sought to curb the rise of this new Protestant England. Yet, in the very isolation that Henry had forged for England, a new opportunity arose. As Europe was torn apart by religious conflict, England's newfound Protestantism provided an opening for alliances with Protestant nations who were already in conflict with Catholic powers. England, under Henry and his successors, began to develop stronger ties with the Protestant states of Northern Europe, offering a fresh avenue for diplomatic and military cooperation. This strategic realignment would be crucial in the decades that followed, especially under the reign of Elizabeth I, when England would face its most direct challenge from Catholic Spain. The result of Henry's break with Rome was a nation caught between two worlds, isolated from Catholic Europe, yet firmly rooted in the Protestant fold, forging new alliances in the process. But just as England began to solidify its position on the European stage, a new threat loomed large, one that would test the kingdom's strength, both internally and externally. The rise of Catholic Spain under Philip II would soon create an existential crisis for England, pushing it to the brink of war, as Spain sought to crush Protestantism once and for all. As England distanced itself from Catholic Europe, a new threat was brewing that would test the very survival of the kingdom. By the late 16th century, England, though still a relatively small player on the world stage, had begun to feel the stirrings of its maritime potential. In the decades preceding the Elizabethan era, the kingdom had undergone a profound shift. The Tudor monarchy, having solidified power under Henry VII, began to look outward, away from the civil strife that had plagued the Wars of the Roses, and toward opportunities for national expansion. However, England's path to becoming a global power was not to follow the established routes of its European counterparts. Unlike Spain and Portugal, whose crowns had long maintained imperial ambitions backed by vast fleets, England's entry into the world of exploration was not one of immediate conquest, but of calculated disruption. It was during the reign of Elizabeth I, following the groundwork laid by her father Henry VIII, that England's maritime ambitions truly began to take shape. The 1500s were a period of growing rivalry between Catholic and Protestant powers, and England, as a Protestant nation in a sea of Catholic monarchies, was keen to secure its own slice of the global empire. However, England lacked the vast resources or long-standing naval tradition of Spain. Instead, Elizabeth turned to a different force, one that was far more unconventional but equally effective: the privateers. Privateers were more than just pirates. They were a product of England's need to disrupt the wealth and power of Spain, which had become the world's most dominant maritime force. Spain's empire, fueled by the riches of the Americas, was the beacon of Catholic wealth, and England's growing frustration with Spanish power led to the creation of a national fleet of privateers who would operate with the Crown's blessing to plunder Spanish treasure fleets and colonies. These privateers were not just driven by the prospect of personal gain. They were driven by national ambition, as England sought to undermine Spain's control of the New World. Sir Francis Drake, perhaps the most renowned of these privateers, would become the symbol of this new English maritime strength. Born into a family of modest means, Drake's early life at sea provided him with the skills and knowledge that would make him one of the greatest naval tacticians of his time. In 1577, Drake set sail on a voyage that would cement his place in history and shift the balance of power between Spain and England. His mission, sanctioned by Elizabeth I, was simple in its objectives: raids on Spanish treasure fleets and disruption of Spanish interests in the Americas. But what started as a mission of piracy quickly evolved into something much greater. Drake's journey was daring, and his circumnavigation of the globe from 1577 to 1580 marked one of the greatest achievements of the age. In the course of his expedition, Drake attacked Spanish ports along the Pacific coast, capturing immense wealth: gold, silver, and other valuable treasures, plundering the Spanish Empire's riches with the efficiency of a seasoned warrior. By the time Drake returned to England, he had not only made himself a fortune, but had also dealt a significant blow to Spain's wealth. Drake's raid on the Spanish treasure fleets was particularly damaging. These fleets were the backbone of Spain's economic power, carrying gold, silver, and jewels from the Americas back to Spain. By attacking these fleets, Drake and other privateers disrupted Spain's monopoly on New World wealth, sending shockwaves through the empire. For England, the treasure seized from these raids was more than just a windfall. It was a statement that England was no longer a passive player in the global race for empire, but a nation capable of challenging the might of Spain on the high seas. However, Drake's success did not go unnoticed. Spain, infuriated by these relentless attacks on its treasure fleets, was preparing for retaliation. As Drake's voyages began to build England's maritime reputation, Spain's monarch, Philip II, grew increasingly anxious about England's growing influence. Spain's wealth, built on its American colonies, was threatened by England's rise. But this was not just about treasure. This was about religious and geopolitical dominance. Spain, a devout Catholic nation, saw England's Protestantism as a direct challenge to Catholic power in Europe. The stage was set for a confrontation that would change the fate of England forever. As Spain's fury rose, England's growing naval power stood ready to face a threat that would define the nation's destiny. The confrontation between these two empires would soon ignite, a struggle not just for control of the seas, but for the survival of England's newfound independence. By 1588, Europe was on the cusp of a monumental shift. The Spanish Armada, That immense fleet of over 130 ships had been assembled to carry out one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history. Its mission was clear: invade England, destroy its navy, and restore the Catholic faith to the Protestant island. Philip II of Spain, seeking to extend his dominance over Europe, knew that to quell the rise of England, it was not enough to suppress its Protestant beliefs. The English threat had grown too strong, its privateers too bold, and its influence too widespread. By smashing England's navy, Philip believed he could cement Spain's position as the uncontested power in Europe. Yet, despite Spain's overwhelming numbers and resources, England stood its ground, led by the sharp strategic mind of Queen Elizabeth I and the audacity of her navy. This was a battle not just for control of the seas, but for the very future of Europe's political and religious landscape. The Spanish Armada represented the culmination of a century of Catholic triumph, but it also marked the beginning of a new age of Protestant resistance, with England as its focal point. England's naval forces, though outnumbered and outgunned, had been carefully shaped by the Queen's strategic vision. The country's naval strength had been evolving since the days of Henry VIII, whose naval reforms laid the groundwork for the later success of the English fleet. Queen Elizabeth, following Henry's footsteps, made substantial investments in modernizing and strengthening England's navy, increasing its fleet, and focusing on the construction of faster, more maneuverable ships. These ships were crucial in the upcoming battle, as they enabled the English to outmaneuver the larger, slower Spanish vessels. England's use of fire ships, vessels set ablaze and sent into the heart of the Spanish fleet, was one such tactic that disrupted Spain's formidable formation, sowing confusion and panic among the Spanish ranks. The battle itself was a strategic masterpiece. The English, commanded by Lord Charles Howard and Sir Francis Drake, engaged the Armada off the coast of Gravelines in the English Channel. The English ships, lighter and faster, were able to dart in and out of the Spanish formation, attacking with precision and speed. The Spanish, with their heavy, cumbersome galleons, struggled to maintain formation. What ensued was a series of skirmishes, with the English navy harassing and damaging the Armada, all the while avoiding a direct confrontation that would have played into Spain's strengths. But perhaps the greatest turning point in the battle was the weather, as the Armada sailed northward, trying to regroup and retreat. A fierce storm, later referred to as the Protestant wind, struck. The storm scattered the Spanish fleet, forcing it to sail into hostile waters and further damaging the already demoralized ships. The winds, which seemed to favor England, were interpreted by the English as a divine sign, confirming their belief that their cause was just and that God had intervened in their favor. The storm caused enough destruction to ensure that Spain could not regroup, and the remnant of the Armada was forced to make its way back to Spain, battered and broken. The victory at Gravelines marked a turning point, not just for England, but for the balance of power in Europe. Spain, though still a major global player, had suffered a crushing blow to its naval power. The Armada's defeat shattered Spain's aura of invincibility and set the stage for a reordering of global dominance. For England, the victory was nothing short of a national triumph. It elevated England to the status of a global naval power, a kingdom that could challenge Spain's hegemony and, in time, expand its reach across the oceans. The immediate impact on Spain was catastrophic. Spain's economic and military strength, so reliant on its treasure fleets and its navy, was deeply wounded. The Spanish Armada, once a symbol of Spain's maritime superiority, was now a relic of a past era. Though Spain would continue to fight for its empire, the defeat would lead to a gradual decline in its ability to project power across the seas. England, meanwhile, would continue to rise, and over the coming decades would go on to dominate maritime trade and exploration, securing its place as the world's preeminent naval power. Yet, the victory at Gravelines came with its own set of challenges. England, now emboldened, would face new threats on the horizon. Internal political struggles, financial strain, and the need to maintain a large, capable navy would test the kingdom in the years to come. Would England's newfound naval dominance last, or would the kingdom find itself facing new challenges as it expanded its influence around the world? With Spain's defeat, England had emerged as the preeminent sea power, but at what cost? And would the rest of Europe now take notice of the island kingdom's ambitions? By the turn of the 17th century, England was no longer a mere island kingdom, struggling for recognition. It was gradually shaping itself into a global power. The story of this transformation is not one of overnight conquest or military triumph, but of a complex interplay of trade, diplomacy, and the establishment of powerful commercial monopolies. And at the heart of this New England was an entity whose influence would extend far beyond the realm of business, the East India Company. In 1600, the English established the East India Company, an entity born of ambition and necessity. England, although a rising maritime power, had yet to secure its share of the wealth and resources flowing from the far reaches of the East. Spain and Portugal had long dominated the trade routes and established vast colonial empires. The East India Company was intended not just as a commercial venture, but as a strategic response to these global giants. The company's charter, granted by Queen Elizabeth I, provided it with not just the authority to trade, but also to wage war, make treaties, and even govern territories. It was, in essence, an extension of English power across the globe. The company's initial foray was simple: to tap into the spice trade. Spices, particularly pepper, nutmeg, and cloves, were prized commodities in Europe, fetching exorbitant prices. But beyond spices, the company also sought to secure trade routes, build factories, and establish ports of call along the coast of India, Southeast Asia, and the Far East. For England, the trade in spices was more than a quest for luxury goods. It was a way to insert itself into the global economy, to weaken the stranglehold of Spanish and Portuguese interests, and to assert English economic power on the world stage. However, the East India Company was more than just a trading firm. It became an institution of empire building. The company's growth was not merely driven by trade, but by the need for territorial control. As it established its trading posts, the company began to exert influence over the local rulers in Asia. Initially, its presence in India was confined to coastal enclaves, but by the mid-17th century, the company had begun to expand its reach, engaging in military campaigns, securing territories, and even establishing its own private armies. The company's expansion into India was marked by its involvement in the Battle of Plassey, 1757, where English-backed forces defeated Indian rulers, thereby securing British control over Bengal, a pivotal moment in the establishment of British rule over India. What began as a simple commercial enterprise gradually morphed into an imperial instrument of power. The company's growing influence, however, wasn't limited to the territorial control it exerted over large parts of Asia. It also began to control the very economies of the regions it dominated. Through monopolies, the company dictated trade, manipulated markets, and profited from the exploitation of resources, including labor. Over the next few decades, the company's grip on Indian trade would become unshakable, making England one of the most powerful economic entities in the world. The company's power was not simply built on gold or spices, but on control. It had its own legal system, its own army, and it maintained direct control over much of the territory it had conquered. Through a combination of coercion, diplomacy, and military force, the company's reach extended deep into the Indian subcontinent. While it was technically a commercial entity, the East India Company's ability to raise private armies and wage war gave it de facto control over vast territories. This was a turning point in England's quest for empire. While Spain had expanded its empire through direct conquest and religious zeal, England's expansion was more insidious, relying on trade, corporate power, and strategic alliances to build an empire that spanned the globe. By the mid-18th century, the company was managing not just trade, but vast swathes of territory, with India emerging as the crown jewel of Britain's growing empire. But as the company began to stretch its tentacles across Asia, it wasn't just trade routes that were being secured, it was the future of empire itself. The company's ability to exert economic and military control in regions as far-flung as India, China, and Southeast Asia laid the groundwork for the British Raj and established England as a true global empire. But the company's methods of expansion, manipulating local politics, displacing native populations, and monopolizing resources, would also bring it into conflict with rival European powers, and, ultimately, with the very populations it sought to control. As the East India Company continued its expansion, England's position in the world would be defined not on the battlefield, but through trade, diplomacy, and the sheer economic dominance of a powerful institution that operated not for the crown, but for itself. The future of the British Empire was being written not by military conquest, but through the strategic manipulation of trade and the subjugation of foreign lands. But as the company began to stretch its tentacles across Asia, the future of an empire would be written not on a battlefield, but through trade and diplomacy. As the 18th century unfolded, the British East India Company stood on the cusp of becoming one of the most powerful institutions in the world. What began as a commercial venture aimed at securing spices and textiles from the distant shores of India had steadily transformed into a militarized empire-building machine, with its eyes set on dominating the rich subcontinent. By 1757, India, with its vast riches and complex political landscape, had become the most coveted prize in the global imperial contest. The British were not the only contenders, but their arrival would eventually shape the subcontinent's future in ways few could have predicted. At the heart of this monumental shift was a single battle, the Battle of Plassey, a confrontation that would forever alter the course of India's history and place the British firmly on the path to imperial dominance in South Asia. It was a battle that would see Robert Clive, an English officer of humble origins, emerge as the symbol of British military brilliance and strategic maneuvering. The battle was not simply a military confrontation between two armies. It was the culmination of years of growing British influence in the region and the breakdown of the traditional Mughal power in Bengal. By the mid-18th century, Bengal was a region of immense wealth, with its fertile land producing grain and textiles in abundance. The Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dawla, ruled the region with a mixture of force and diplomacy, but his rule was undermined by internal dissent and the growing influence of the British. The East India Company, whose commercial ambitions had already entrenched it in the region, now found itself at odds with the Nawab over trade rights and political interference. The Nawab's attempts to oust the British from Bengal, including the capture of Fort William and the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident, made the confrontation inevitable. Robert Clive, appointed to lead the British forces, recognized that a direct military confrontation with the Nawab's much larger and better equipped army might result in disaster. Instead, he employed a brilliant strategy of subterfuge and manipulation, sowing discord within the ranks of the Nawab's army. Understanding the political fractures within the Indian subcontinent, Clive brokered secret alliances with key Bengali officials who had been marginalized by the Nawab's rule. These alliances, though fragile, were enough to tip the scales in favor of the British. As the battle unfolded, Clive's forces, though numerically inferior, exploited these divisions, defeating the Nawab's army in a mere few hours. The Battle of Plassey was not a victory born of overwhelming military might, but of diplomatic maneuvering, psychological warfare, and the exploitation of local rivalries. In the aftermath of the battle, Clive's forces were able to seize control of the vast wealth of Bengal, and with it, the Nawab's throne. The British were granted the right to collect taxes from the region, a power that fundamentally altered the economic landscape of India. The spoils of war, rich revenues, grain, jewels, and valuable trade goods were funneled into the East India Company, ensuring its financial dominance. With Bengal now under British control, the company was able to expand its territory, creating the economic backbone that would fuel British imperialism across India. The significance of Plassey was clear. The East India Company, once a commercial trading venture, was now an agent of territorial conquest. The victory solidified British rule in Bengal and laid the foundation for a century of imperial expansion across India. But it wasn't just a military victory. It was the beginning of a new phase of British engagement with India, one that would see the East India Company evolve from a corporate entity into a powerful colonial governmental force. The company's private armies would continue to grow, and it would become the de facto ruling power in vast swaths of the subcontinent. The consequences of Plassey stretched far beyond the battlefield. While the British secured territorial control over Bengal, it marked the start of a brutal process of extraction that would see the draining of resources from India to fund the expanding British Empire. The native population would bear the brunt of this exploitation, as British policies of taxation and monopolization left many regions impoverished and destabilized. The influence of local rulers was eclipsed by the growing power of the East India Company, and with it, the rise of British authority. Yet, while the Battle of Plassey secured British dominance in Bengal, it also set the stage for future resistance. The company's method of rule, relying on manipulation, coercion, and displacement, would create deep divisions that would eventually lead to uprisings, most notably the Indian Rebellion of 1857. The deep resentment of Indian rulers and the alienation of the local population would, in time, make British rule increasingly unsustainable. However, the victory at Plassey marked the beginning of British dominance in India, and as the company expanded its reach, another much larger force was quietly amassing on the horizon. The future of an empire would not be decided by the clash of armies, but by the forces of trade, diplomacy, and the complex webs of political maneuvering that would shape the next phase of British imperialism across Asia. But as one battle secured British dominance in India, another much larger force was quietly amassing on the horizon. As England began to cast its eyes on the vast, unexplored expanse of the New World in the late 16th century, it was not the first European power to dream of empire in the Americas. Spain and Portugal had already claimed vast territories, fueled by their conquests in the Caribbean, South America, and the Philippines. France, too, had begun laying the groundwork for its own ventures in North America. For England, the challenge was not only about claiming land, but about establishing a viable presence in a region already dominated by established powers. Yet, the English drive for expansion could not be deterred, and by the late 1500s, England's ambitions in the New World were gaining momentum. However, England's early attempts at colonization were fraught with setbacks and failures, none more significant than the Roanoke colony. The Roanoke expedition, led by Sir Walter Raleigh in 1585, marked the first serious attempt by England to establish a permanent settlement in the Americas. Raleigh, encouraged by the promise of new resources and the hope of competing with Spain, sent a group of settlers to the coast of modern-day North Carolina. The plan was to create a self-sustaining colony that would be both a strategic foothold for English trade and a base from which to launch further expeditions into the New World. But the Roanoke colony faced immediate, crippling challenges. The settlers, unprepared for the harsh realities of establishing a colony so far from England, found themselves struggling with food shortages, lack of infrastructure, and the challenge of establishing relations with the indigenous tribes. The native populations around Roanoke, particularly the Croatan and Socotan tribes, had long been suspicious of European settlers, having witnessed the greed and violence of previous explorers. The settlers' attempts to forge alliances with the tribes were fraught with misunderstandings and conflict. The colony's attempts to trade for supplies from the local population were often unsuccessful, and the tensions between the settlers and indigenous tribes further isolated Roanoke from the rest of the world. At the same time, the supply chain between Roanoke and England was woefully inadequate. Ships sent from England to resupply the colony arrived only sporadically, often with delayed shipments of goods, and there was no sustainable system for regular communication. The settlers were isolated, and when a critical resupply mission finally arrived in 1588, they found the colony completely deserted, with only the mysterious word Croatoan carved into a post, a haunting reminder of the colony's abrupt disappearance. This failure, while tragic, was a pivotal moment in England's efforts at colonization. Roanoke's collapse was more than just an isolated disaster. It was a lesson in what went wrong: inadequate supply chains, poor relations with indigenous peoples, and the lack of sustained royal support. As a result, England began to understand that colonial ventures required more than just ships and settlers. They needed proper logistics, sustained resources, and a clear, supportive relationship with both the Crown and local leaders. The mystery of Roanoke, in fact, served as an impetus for England's future colonial efforts. A decade later, in 1607, England made another attempt at colonization, this time in Virginia, with the establishment of Jamestown, a colony that would succeed where Roanoke had failed. The lessons learned from Roanoke, particularly the importance of consistent supply chains, strong leadership, and improved relations with native tribes, shaped the strategy behind Jamestown's founding. The Virginia Company, founded to fund the settlement, would learn to negotiate with indigenous groups, such as the Powhatan Confederacy, securing trade agreements that allowed the colony to survive and eventually thrive. But it wasn't just the logistical elements that changed. The failure at Roanoke revealed the depth of England's commitment to establishing a permanent presence in the New World. The Crown's involvement and royal support for Jamestown were more steadfast than it had been for Roanoke, and with the arrival of John Smith and the eventual introduction of tobacco farming, Jamestown began to flourish. Over time, the lessons from Roanoke would lead to the establishment of more successful colonies, like those in New England and the Caribbean, paving the way for the growth of the British Empire in the Americas. However, the failure of Roanoke was not merely a lesson in logistics and diplomacy. It was a mystery that lingered in the minds of English officials for decades, a haunting reminder of what might have been. The empty colony was a symbol of both England's potential and the vast uncertainty of venturing into the unknown. It left behind not only unanswered questions about what had happened to the settlers, but also a new determination to succeed where Roanoke had failed. But despite failure, one colony would prove the turning point for Britain's future in the Americas. By the early 1600s, Virginia, though a fledgling colony, began to show signs of potential, but its survival was fragile. The early years were marked by hardship and failure, with settlers facing constant threats from disease, food shortages, and tensions with indigenous tribes. The colony's future depended on finding a product that could be exported back to England, something that would secure its economic survival and justify the risk of settlement in a land far from home. That product came in the form of tobacco, a crop that would transform not only the economic landscape of Virginia, but also the course of its social and labor structures. By the late 1610s, Virginia was poised for a breakthrough. Tobacco cultivation became the colony's economic engine, driving the demand for labor and creating a cycle of wealth and exploitation that would shape the colony's future. England's appetite for tobacco surged. Virginia's settlers expanded their plantations to meet the demand, securing a steady stream of income for both the colony and the English crown. However, the rapid expansion of tobacco farming posed a problem. The demand for labor exceeded the supply of willing workers. The indentured servants, who had initially been promised land and wages in exchange for their labor, were not enough to sustain the burgeoning plantation economy. The settlers needed a new, more permanent source of labor, one that would ensure cheap, reliable work in the fields for decades to come. This would come in the form of enslaved Africans. Beginning in the early 1620s, enslaved Africans were brought to Virginia to meet the colony's insatiable labor demands. Unlike indentured servants, who could eventually gain their freedom, enslaved Africans were forced into lifelong labor, and their children inherited their status. This marked a profound shift in Virginia's labor system, as slavery became entrenched as the dominant form of labor in the colony. Over time, the number of enslaved Africans grew rapidly as the economy of Virginia expanded and the plantation system spread across the South. With the introduction of slavery came the growing racial divide that would define the colony. Virginia's economic success was now driven by a system built on racial inequality and the exploitation of enslaved people. As the plantation economy boomed, Virginia's elite grew wealthier. But this wealth came at an unfathomable cost. The forced labor of millions of enslaved Africans, whose lives were reduced to tools of economic production. The economy that had once struggled to survive was now thriving, but at the price of its humanity. This exploitative system created not just an economic foundation, but a social hierarchy that would deeply influence the political and cultural landscape of Virginia, and eventually, all of the southern colonies. The profitability of tobacco and the widespread use of enslaved labor would influence not only local governance, but also Britain's imperial policies towards its colonies, making the system of slavery an integral part of the empire's global economic network. But as Virginia thrived, so too did the dark side of the empire, the economic engine driven by the labor of enslaved people, marking the beginning of an exploitative system that would shape the future of the American colonies. As the demand for tobacco increased, the British Empire would become ever more reliant on the exploitation of enslaved people, making this system not just a regional issue, but a cornerstone of the empire's economic power. By the mid-19th century, the Victorian era marked a turning point for the British Empire. England, long recognized as a leading global power, now entered a period of extraordinary industrialization and technological innovation that would reshape its economic, political, and imperial landscape. The impact of these changes was far-reaching, but none more so than the expansion of British control in Asia and Africa through the advent of technological marvels such as the steamship, the railway, and the Suez Canal, an engineering triumph that would become a linchpin in maintaining British dominance across vast territories. At the heart of this period was the Suez Canal, completed in 1869, which revolutionized the way Britain could control and access its imperial territories. The canal, which cut through the narrow Isthmus of Suez and connected the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea, was a remarkable feat of engineering. It reduced the travel time for ships from Europe to Asia, bypassing the long and perilous route around Africa. For the British Empire, which already had vast colonial holdings in India, the Middle East, and parts of Africa, the canal was not just a commercial asset, it was a strategic military and economic lifeline. By linking the Mediterranean to the Indian Ocean, the canal allowed British forces and trade goods to flow more easily and quickly between Europe and the East, tightening the empire's hold on its colonies and strengthening its presence in Asia and Africa. The opening of the Suez Canal was more than a simple engineering feat. It marked a shift in how Britain projected its power. The canal made the British Navy and merchant fleet even more formidable, providing a direct route for steamships traveling between Europe and India, the Far East, and Australia. The British Navy, already the world's most powerful, now had an even greater ability to defend its interests and respond to crises swiftly. Steamships, which had already begun to replace sailing vessels in the early 1800s, allowed Britain to control its trade routes with unprecedented efficiency and speed. The Suez Canal made it easier to move troops, supplies, and reinforcements across continents, ensuring Britain's ability to subdue rebellions, quash resistance, and maintain order within its far-flung colonies. The Industrial Revolution, which had already transformed British society in terms of mass production, labour, and urbanization, now played a critical role in the expansion of Britain's imperial control. Steamships became the primary mode of transportation on both the oceans and on the vast rivers that ran through Africa and Asia. This was complemented by the rapid development of railways, which linked inland territories to the coasts, making the vast landscapes of India, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia more accessible. Railways became the arteries of empire, allowing the British to easily transport troops, raw materials, and goods over long distances, strengthening their grip on the colonies. For Britain, these technological innovations were nothing short of transformative. The expansion of the railroad system in India, for instance, not only facilitated economic exploitation by making it easier to transport raw materials to British-controlled ports for export, but it also allowed for military mobilization on an unprecedented scale. Railways allowed the British to send troops and supplies quickly to places like Punjab or Bengal in times of unrest, reinforcing their ability to quash uprisings and maintain control over vast, often hostile territories. Similarly, the ability to move quickly across Africa using rail and steamship networks meant that the British could extend their imperial influence into regions like East Africa, West Africa, and the Congo, ensuring that the British Empire remained firmly entrenched in Africa's economic and strategic heartland. But these advancements came at a significant cost. The expansion of British power through the Suez Canal and industrial technologies such as railways and steamships was fueled by exploitation, colonial labour, and the subjugation of indigenous populations. The wealth generated from these technologies flowed directly into British coffers, while the labour that built the infrastructure of empire, whether it was the workers constructing the railways in India, the dock workers in Egypt, or the miners in South Africa, was largely carried out by the enslaved or exploited labourers who suffered under the British system of control. The rapid expansion of the British Empire, fueled by industrialisation and technological superiority, brought a new level of dominance over global trade and military power. However, it also sowed the seeds for conflict and resistance. While Britain's ability to control vast territories and dominate global trade seemed unassailable, it was becoming increasingly clear that the empire was not invincible. The more the British expanded, the more they faced resistance from within and outside the empire. Rising nationalism, anti-colonial movements, and growing discontent among the colonized peoples began to surface. India, for example, which had long been the jewel in the crown of the British Empire, saw the rise of revolutionary movements calling for independence, and anti-imperialist sentiments spread throughout Africa and Asia. Could Britain maintain control of such a vast empire? The economic engine driving British imperialism had been fueled by technological innovations and the labor of colonized peoples, but these advancements also laid the groundwork for resistance that would become increasingly difficult to suppress. As Britain's influence in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East grew, so too did the seeds of rebellion that would one day erupt in violent conflict. As Britain's dominance grew, so too did resistance from within and outside the empire. Could Britain maintain control of such a vast empire? By the late 19th century, the world was undergoing a transformation driven by industrialization, global competition, and the quest for resources. Among the most ambitious and contentious endeavors of the time was the scramble for Africa, a period in which European powers, driven by the hunger for land, wealth, and power, divided up the entire African continent among themselves. This imperial conquest of Africa was not only a monumental chapter in the history of European imperialism, but also a pivotal moment for Britain, whose colonial ambitions reached their zenith during this period. The formal partition of Africa was given a sense of legitimacy and order by the Berlin Conference of 1884 or 1885, convened by Chancellor Otto von Bismarck of Germany. The European powers gathered in Berlin not to debate the future of the African people, but to draw up borders that would divide Africa into spheres of influence, effectively deciding how the continent would be carved up for European exploitation. The conference itself was marked by its utter disregard for the existing political structures of Africa, as it ignored the sovereignty of indigenous populations and disregarded the social, ethnic, and cultural divisions that defined African communities. The lines on the map drawn by these European powers had little to do with reality on the ground, but they would shape the continent's fate for decades to come. For Britain, the Berlin Conference was a turning point, as it solidified Britain's control over vast swaths of territory in East and West Africa, along with key coastal regions, including South Africa. Cecil Rhodes, a British businessman and fervent imperialist, embodied the bold ambitions of the British Empire in Africa. His desire to build a Cape to Cairo railroad, a continuous line of British-controlled territory running from South Africa to Egypt, symbolized Britain's vision for dominance in Africa. Rhodes believed that it was Britain's destiny to control Africa, and he used his wealth and political connections to secure British control over large parts of southern Africa. His creation of the British South Africa Company, which was given authority over vast territories in modern-day Zimbabwe and Zambia, highlighted the power of British private interests in Africa during this time. British involvement in Africa, however, was not limited to businessmen like Rhodes. Colonial administrators and military leaders began imposing British control over African peoples and their lands. The British sought to extract resources and wealth from their colonies through the establishment of plantations, mines, and other industries that were designed to benefit the British Empire, often at the expense of African communities. Land dispossession became a common policy, as native Africans were stripped of their ancestral lands to make way for European settlers and commercial enterprises. In Kenya, for example, British settlers were granted large tracts of land, while indigenous peoples were forced to live in reserves, pushed further into marginalized areas. Beyond land dispossession, Britain implemented a range of policies aimed at suppressing indigenous populations and quelling any resistance to colonial rule. In South Africa, the British instituted a system of apartheid-like segregation, systematically denying the indigenous African population their rights and freedoms. The British used military force to put down uprisings and to assert their dominance over rebellious groups. The Maji Rebellion in German East Africa, which was brutally suppressed by the German military, was one of the most well-known examples of resistance to European imperialism in Africa. However, Britain's role in quelling resistance was equally severe, as it used its superior military technology and infrastructure to crush any challenges to its dominance. The British also utilized policies of indirect rule, which were designed to maintain British control over African territories while relying on existing traditional leaders to govern on Britain's behalf. While this method helped minimize the need for large numbers of British troops, it also led to the undermining of indigenous power structures, as local leaders were forced to act as puppets of the imperial powers, enforcing British laws and policies against their own people. These policies had long-lasting consequences for Africa. The dispossession of land, the forced displacement of populations, and the imposition of European legal and political systems not only disrupted African societies, but also set the stage for economic exploitation that would last well into the 20th century. Education, healthcare, and agriculture were tailored to serve the needs of the British Empire, rather than the indigenous populations, leaving Africa's economies heavily dependent on British goods and services. The long-term legacy of colonial rule was a continent fragmented by artificial borders, with political instability, ethnic tensions, and economic dependence that would persist long after the British Empire's departure. But despite the success of British imperialism in Africa during the late 19th century, this era of expansion also marked the beginning of the empire's decline. The oppression and exploitation of indigenous populations, coupled with the growing demands for self-rule and independence across the colonies, would eventually lead to revolutionary movements in Africa and around the globe. The forces of nationalism, economic exploitation, and human rights abuses began to create a growing sense of resistance to British rule that would become increasingly difficult to suppress. As Britain's dominance grew, so too did resistance, not only from within Africa, but from other imperial powers who sought to challenge Britain's hold on the continent. Germany, France, and Belgium also staked their claims in Africa, setting the stage for rivalries and conflicts that would escalate into the First World War. The nationalist movements that began to gain momentum in the early 20th century would become a significant challenge to the imperial system, as the indigenous populations of Africa and Asia fought to reclaim their sovereignty. Could Britain maintain control of such a vast empire, stretching from the tip of South Africa to the shores of Egypt and deep into the heart of West Africa? While Britain's industrial and military power allowed it to dominate the world for much of the 19th century, the seeds of its decline were already being sown. The exploitation of native peoples, the economic strain of maintaining such a vast empire, and the growing demands for independence from colonized peoples were beginning to create cracks in the foundation of British imperialism. The world was changing, and so too was the British Empire. But as Britain's empire reached its height, the seeds of its decline were already being sown as new forces began to challenge imperial power. The early 20th century was a period of profound transformation for the British Empire, a time when two world wars would fundamentally reshape its global power, economic structure, and relationship with its colonies. The immense toll of World War I, 1914 and 1918, on Britain, both in terms of human cost and financial strain, set the stage for a shift in imperial dynamics, one that would reverberate throughout the colonies. The once unassailable might of Britain was now tested by the destruction and exhaustion that followed the Great War. The first global conflict had far-reaching consequences for the British Empire, affecting not only the home islands, but also its colonies across the world. As the war escalated, the British Empire relied heavily on its colonial resources, not just in terms of soldiers, but also raw materials and economic contributions. India, Africa, and the Caribbean sent millions of troops to fight alongside the British in the trenches of Europe, while colonial factories and mines were repurposed to support the war effort. This participation, however, came at a cost. The physical and economic drain of the war would leave the colonies questioning their relationship with Britain and their role in its conflicts. World War I deeply strained the resources of Britain, both financially and militarily. The British military establishment, stretched thin by the demands of the war, increasingly relied on its colonies to supply soldiers and materiel. The sacrifices made by colonial soldiers in the trenches of Europe, in the deserts of the Middle East, and across the fields of Africa left a deep impact on the psyche of these colonies. Many in the colonies began to ask, if they were willing to fight and die for Britain, what did they have to show for it? What did it mean to be a subject of the British Empire? As the war ended, the impact of Britain's struggles became more apparent. The empire, already exhausted by the cost of maintaining such a vast territorial expanse, found itself in debt and weakened by the immense human loss incurred during the conflict. India, whose soldiers had fought valiantly on behalf of Britain, began to demand a greater share in the governance of their own affairs. Africa and the Caribbean, where nationalism and a desire for self-determination were beginning to take root, became more vocal in their calls for autonomy. The economic burden of war had stretched Britain thin, and as a result, the imperial project now seemed more unsustainable than ever. Moreover, the political landscape had shifted. The ideals that had driven European colonialism, of civilizing missions, and the supposed superiority of Western cultures were now being questioned both within Britain and in its colonies. The devastation of World War I had opened the eyes of many in Britain's colonies, and the human cost of war forced a reconsideration of what it meant to be part of the British Empire. The war had forced Britain to rely on its colonies, but it had also planted the seeds of resentment and rebellion, particularly among the educated elite in colonies like India and parts of Africa. After the war, the British Empire found itself in a post-war era of instability, with economic hardship at home and rising demands for political independence from its colonies. These shifts were exacerbated by the changing global order, as former colonial powers like Germany and Ottoman Turkey were shattered, and new powers, such as the United States and Soviet Union, began to challenge Britain's position as the dominant global power. The aftermath of World War I left Britain vulnerable. Its empire was no longer the unchallenged force it once was, and the imperial system began to show cracks. As the Great Depression of the 1930s further strained Britain's financial resources, it became clear that the status quo could not be maintained indefinitely. The economic collapse hit Britain hard, and the empire was forced to cut back on its spending, including its military and administrative costs in the colonies. Nationalist movements across the British Empire, especially in India, Egypt, and parts of Africa, began to gain momentum. In India, the Indian National Congress had gained significant ground in its push for self-rule, while leaders like Mahatma Gandhi began to inspire a new generation of anti-colonial activists. Then, as the world hurtled into the Second World War, Britain's empire found itself yet again stretched to its limits. World War II, 1939 to 1945, intensified the imperial crisis that had already begun after the First World War. With the Nazi threat in Europe, Britain had no choice but to again turn to its colonies for military support and resources. But this time, the sacrifices demanded of the colonies were even greater. Indian soldiers fought in greater numbers than ever, while African and Caribbean soldiers joined the British forces across the world. As the war raged on, the British Empire grew more reliant on its colonies. Yet the very nature of this reliance created new questions about the future of the empire itself. In India, the impact of World War II was profound. The sacrifices of the colonial subjects during the war, coupled with economic hardship and a growing nationalist movement, led many to question why they were still subjected to British rule. The Quit India movement of 1942, led by Gandhi and the Indian National Congress, demanded an immediate end to British rule. Although the British quashed the movement militarily, the seeds of independence were firmly planted. The war had weakened Britain's ability to suppress the rising calls for self-determination. But it wasn't just in India where Britain's imperial control was weakening. Throughout Africa, Asia, and even the Caribbean, independence movements were gaining strength, inspired by the idea that colonized peoples had proven their loyalty by fighting for Britain in its wars, only to return to the same oppression and exploitation they had faced before. The world wars had altered the landscape of global power, and the British Empire, already overstretched and weakened by its war debts, could no longer control its colonies with the same iron grip it once had. While World War I had set the stage for growing demands for independence, it was World War II that would prove to be the final catalyst for the decline of the British Empire. The wars had drained Britain's resources and had shown the vulnerability of an empire built on colonial subjugation. The effects of the wars went far beyond the battlefield. They laid the groundwork for the end of British imperial rule, as colonial subjects, once loyal to the empire, began to demand the freedom they had fought for during the wars. But as Britain's empire reached its height, the seeds of its decline were already being sown, as new forces began to challenge imperial power. As the smoke of the Second World War began to clear, a new world order was emerging, one that would forever change the geopolitical landscape. The British Empire, which had once spanned the globe, was now a shadow of its former self. World War II had drained Britain's resources and weakened its political will, leaving it incapable of maintaining control over its vast colonies. As the British Empire struggled to recover, the winds of decolonization began to sweep across Asia and Africa. The first great rupture in the empire occurred in 1947, when India, the jewel of Britain's imperial crown, was granted independence. But the birth of a new nation was far from peaceful. It was marked by violence, religious strife, and a painful division that would forever scar the subcontinent. India's struggle for independence had been long and arduous. Mahatma Gandhi, the leader of the Indian National Congress, had spent decades fighting for non-violent resistance against British rule. Gandhi's philosophy of satyagraha, or non-violent civil disobedience, inspired millions of Indians to protest British rule in a way that was fundamentally different from the violent uprisings that had preceded it. The British, weary from the financial and military toll of the war, found it increasingly difficult to suppress the growing independence movement. By the end of the war, the pressure for Indian self-rule was overwhelming. The British Labour government, which took office in 1945 under Clement Attlee, was more sympathetic to Indian demands for independence than their predecessors. The realization that Britain could no longer afford to hold on to its empire, especially in the face of increasing unrest, led to the decision to grant India independence. But while independence was inevitable, how to achieve it was far more complicated. The Hindu-majority Indian National Congress and the Muslim League, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, were at odds over how the future of the country should be structured. The Muslim League, which represented the interests of India's Muslim population, had long feared that a unified India would marginalize them politically. The demand for a separate state, Pakistan, had been gaining momentum for years. Faced with the growing threat of civil war between Hindus and Muslims, the British government decided to partition India into two separate nations. The Indian Independence Act of 1947 created India and Pakistan, with Pakistan consisting of two geographically separate regions, West Pakistan, modern-day Pakistan, and East Pakistan, modern-day Bangladesh. The partition was meant to resolve religious and political tensions, but it did little to address the deep-rooted animosity between the two groups. Instead, it set the stage for one of the most tragic chapters in South Asia's history. The partition of India sparked a mass migration and displacement of populations on an unprecedented scale. Hindus and Sikhs fled Pakistan, while Muslims sought refuge in the newly formed Pakistan. The violence that accompanied this migration was catastrophic. Religious riots, massacres, and ethnic cleansing engulfed the subcontinent as communities that had lived together for centuries were torn apart by the lines of partition. More than 1 million people are estimated to have died in the violence, and millions more were displaced from their homes. The trauma of partition left scars that would last for generations, and the relationship between India and Pakistan would be defined by conflict and bitterness for decades to come. For the British, India's partition and subsequent independence marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. The loss of India, the crown jewel of the empire, symbolized the disintegration of a colonial system that had once stretched across the globe. The British Raj had been a cornerstone of Britain's global power, but its collapse signaled the shift in global power dynamics. The British could no longer hold on to their empire as waves of independence movements spread across Africa and Asia in the coming decades. India's independence was not just the end of British rule in the subcontinent, it was the beginning of the collapse of an entire imperial system. But the partition of India was only the beginning. As India gained independence in 1947, the reverberations were felt far beyond the subcontinent. The decolonization movement was gaining momentum across the globe. Other colonies, once subjugated by European powers, began to demand their freedom. Ghana would become the first African colony to gain independence from Britain in 1957, and the wave of independence would continue to ripple across Africa and the Caribbean throughout the 1960s and 1970s. For Britain, India's independence marked the loss of its most powerful colonial possession, but it also signaled the end of a global empire that had once controlled vast swaths of land across the globe. Could Britain maintain control over its far-flung territories as nationalist movements gained traction and independence movements flourished? The events of 1947 were not an isolated incident. They marked the beginning of the end for the British Empire. The forces of imperial decline, once hidden beneath the surface of British power, were now undeniable. India's independence, with its painful partition, was the spark that ignited a global wave of decolonization that would sweep through the rest of the British Empire in the coming decades. As India gained independence, other colonies began to follow suit. Was this the inevitable end of an empire? The fall of the British Empire in the mid-20th century marked the end of an era, a seismic shift in global power dynamics that reshaped not just the map of the world, but the very foundations of international relations. Yet, while the empire itself crumbled, Britain's role on the global stage was far from over. In the aftermath of its imperial decline, Britain found itself navigating a new, unfamiliar post-imperial world. The Commonwealth of Nations, which evolved from the once vast British Empire, became a key framework for maintaining cultural, political, and economic ties between Britain and its former colonies. The formation of the Commonwealth established in the mid-20th century, was an attempt by Britain to forge a new kind of relationship with the nations that had once been part of its empire. Unlike the rigid structures of empire, the Commonwealth was meant to be an association of independent states, a voluntary partnership based on shared values and mutual interests. Initially, the Commonwealth was centered on maintaining the connections of a Britain that had once ruled over vast territories, but over time, it evolved into a forum for cooperation between former colonies and Britain itself. The political and economic bonds were maintained, though no longer through the mechanisms of empire, but through a more egalitarian system of diplomacy. Despite the end of Britain's direct colonial control, many former colonies, especially those in Africa, the Caribbean, and Asia, continued to maintain close relationships with Britain in the decades after their independence. Britain's economic influence remained significant as the Commonwealth countries began to trade amongst themselves, fostering a sense of solidarity that tied them back to their former imperial master. British business interests continued to play a crucial role in the economies of many former colonies, with British companies still holding prominent positions in sectors like mining, trade, and infrastructure development. Cultural exchange also played an essential role, as former colonies continued to draw from British institutions, especially the legal system, education, and parliamentary democracy. However, the relationship between Britain and its former colonies was not without tension. The legacy of imperialism was not easily forgotten, and the wounds of exploitation, racial inequality, and economic disparity persisted long after independence. Many former colonies harbored deep resentment over the colonial experience, and the post-imperial relationship with Britain was often fraught with complex feelings of admiration and anger. For some, Britain's role in shaping their political and economic systems was still seen as a necessary evil that had provided stability and infrastructure, while for others, it was a symbol of colonial oppression that had deprived them of their own sovereignty. One of the key elements that continued to bind Britain and its former colonies was the English language. English became the common tongue of the Commonwealth, serving as a unifying force that connected countries as diverse as India, Canada, Kenya, and Australia. It was the language of diplomacy, of international business, and of education. Even as many former colonies built their own national identities and languages, English remained a symbol of their shared history with Britain. It was a practical tool for international communication, but also a cultural inheritance that many saw as a reminder of their colonial past, both a blessing and a curse. In terms of global politics, Britain's role underwent a dramatic transformation. No longer the dominant imperial power, Britain shifted its focus to being a leading member of the global community, engaging in new alliances and multilateral organizations. Its participation in the United Nations, the World Trade Organization, and, later, its membership in the European Economic Community, which would eventually evolve into the European Union, were all expressions of Britain's desire to adapt to a world where global cooperation was becoming increasingly important. Britain's status on the world stage was no longer defined by its colonial possessions, but by its capacity to engage diplomatically, economically, and militarily with both the old imperial powers and newly rising nations. In the Cold War period, Britain also navigated a complicated relationship with both the United States and the Soviet Union, adjusting to a world order dominated by superpowers. Despite its decline as an imperial force, Britain maintained a strong alliance with the United States, underpinned by shared interests in democracy, trade, and defense. But Britain also sought to remain relevant in a world dominated by the two superpowers, forging its path as a bridge between the Western Bloc and the newly emerging nations of the Global South. Britain's continued importance was not rooted in empire, but in its ability to function within the new geopolitical realities of the 20th century. Yet, despite these efforts to maintain influence on the global stage, Britain was fundamentally altered by its loss of empire. The Suez Crisis of 1956 exposed the limitations of British power and demonstrated that the days of unilateral, imperial dominance were over. Britain could no longer act without the approval of the United States or the United Nations. The humiliating failure of the Suez Crisis revealed that Britain, though still a global power, was now operating in a world where former colonies, along with new global players, held considerable sway. Britain's imperial dreams were gone, and with them, much of the confidence it had once had in its ability to shape global events. But the legacy of the empire didn't disappear overnight. It continued to echo in the world long after the end of British rule in places like India, Africa, and the Caribbean. The cultural, economic, and political ties that Britain had forged over centuries remained influential, even as former colonies asserted their independence and began to forge their own futures. The Commonwealth, despite its imperfections, served as a reminder of the connections that persisted between Britain and its former colonies, even if these connections were now defined by mutual respect, trade, and diplomacy, rather than the coercive force of imperial control. And yet, the British Empire's legacy was far from settled. New forces were already rising that would challenge the very legacy of colonialism itself. As former colonies sought to define their own identities, economic power shifted toward Asia and Africa, while new global alliances began to emerge. Britain was no longer the center of the world, but the ripple effects of its past would continue to shape the geopolitics of the future. Though the empire was gone, its legacy still echoed across the world, shaping the geopolitics of the future. The legacy of the British Empire is a complicated tapestry, woven with both achievements and atrocities. For over 3 centuries, Britain ruled over a vast swath of the globe, controlling territories in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, and the Americas. The impact of this empire is still felt today, and the debates surrounding its moral legacy are as fierce as ever. Was British imperialism ultimately a force for progress, bringing democracy, education, and infrastructure to vast swaths of the world? Or was it a system built on exploitation, violence, and economic plunder? The truth, as is often the case with such a complex issue, lies somewhere in between. At its core, the British Empire was driven by a deep desire for economic exploitation, for wealth, resources, and power. The colonies were seen as nothing more than resources to be extracted, with natives often treated as inferior, marginalized, and subjugated. The Atlantic slave trade, which Britain played a central role in, is one of the most egregious stains on the empire's moral record, as millions of Africans were torn from their homes, sold into slavery, and forced to work under brutal conditions on British-controlled plantations in the Caribbean, North America, and South America. Similarly, the opium trade in China, which Britain helped to cultivate, caused widespread addiction and suffering, all in the pursuit of profit. Yet, to reduce the British Empire's legacy solely to exploitation would be a gross simplification. Despite the empire's economic motivations, it also facilitated the spread of ideas, particularly in the areas of democracy, education, and infrastructure. British rule laid the foundations for many of the political and social institutions we associate with the modern world. In India, for example, the British introduced the rule of law, a parliamentary system, and a legal framework that still forms the backbone of India's democratic system today. Similarly, many of Britain's former colonies have adopted the English language, which, despite its colonial roots, has become a global lingua franca for business, diplomacy, and science. These contributions cannot be ignored, as they have had long-lasting effects on global trade, governance, and communication. The spread of education was another positive side of imperial rule. Missionary schools and British-run educational systems introduced new ideas about science, literature, and governance to millions of people. Western-style schools were established in places like India, Africa, and the Caribbean, giving many indigenous populations access to formal education for the first time. The British Empire, in its efforts to govern vast, diverse territories, developed an extensive system of infrastructure, including railways, roads, ports, and telecommunication networks, which often proved useful long after decolonization. These structures helped to connect regions, improve trade, and in some cases, even contribute to economic development after independence. However, these positive developments must be viewed in the broader context of imperial rule, which was underpinned by a fundamentally exploitative system. British colonial authorities often used infrastructure and education as tools to maintain control, enforcing British political and economic interests. The benefits of British rule were rarely distributed equally. They overwhelmingly served the interests of the colonizers, not the colonized. The marginalization and displacement of indigenous populations, whether in Africa, India, or the Caribbean, are part of the darker side of empire. Whole cultures were suppressed, land was taken, and economic systems were reoriented to favor colonial extraction rather than local prosperity. In many cases, indigenous peoples were left with little autonomy, and the national identities of many countries were shaped by artificial borders and policies designed to serve imperial interests. The ethical implications of the British Empire's legacy continue to spark heated debates. For many, the positive aspects, such as the spread of democracy, education, and modern infrastructure, are seen as evidence that British rule had some long-term benefits. For others, the economic exploitation, social inequality, and cultural damage wrought by imperialism overshadow any positive contributions. The legacy of colonialism is not just about the past. It continues to shape the modern world, influencing race relations, economic disparities, and international power dynamics. The question of the empire's moral legacy is particularly poignant today, as many former colonies continue to struggle with the long-lasting effects of British rule. In some cases, the legacies of colonialism are celebrated in the form of national pride in former British institutions, while in others, the focus is on reparations and acknowledgement of the damages caused by centuries of exploitation. The Commonwealth of Nations, for instance, remains a symbolic association of former colonies. But the question of whether Britain truly acknowledges its historical responsibility remains contentious. In the heart of modern Britain, imperial nostalgia sometimes resurfaces through media, politics, or cultural debate, often clouding the reality of the empire's complex and painful legacy. For many in former colonies, the memory of imperial rule is still raw, and debates about reparations, return of artifacts, and acknowledging wrongdoings continue to fuel tensions. As Britain continues to move forward in the 21st century, it faces the legacy of an empire that spanned continents and shaped the world in profound ways. Though the empire is gone, the debates over its legacy remain very much alive. Can Britain ever truly escape the moral and cultural scars left by its imperial past? Is it possible for a nation to sever itself from the chains of colonial history and move forward without reckoning with the consequences of its actions? As Britain moves forward, the question remains, can a nation ever truly escape its imperial past? As the sunset of empire fades into the twilight of history, Modern-day Britain stands as a nation profoundly shaped by the vast reach of its imperial past. The world may have changed dramatically since the days of its imperial glory, but the echoes of the British Empire remain deeply embedded in the country's identity. London, the heart of the empire, still bears the physical and cultural marks of its once mighty dominion. Grand buildings line the streets, many of them products of an era when Britain ruled the waves and governed continents. The Palace of Westminster, St. Paul's Cathedral, and the sprawling Victoria and Albert Museum are just a few of the monuments that tell the story of Britain's imperial reach, symbols of wealth and power, derived from centuries of colonial exploitation, trade, and conquest. As you walk through the streets of modern Britain, the past can feel ever present. The English language, once the tool of imperial control, now serves as the lingua franca of the world, spoken by billions across continents. The influence of British culture, from its literature to its legal systems, continues to permeate nations once governed by the empire. British institutions, including its parliamentary system, the rule of law, and its public education system, remain the foundation for many nations that were once part of the empire. Yet, these institutions and practices, born out of empire, exist in a complicated dance with the post-colonial world. While many countries continue to honor and preserve these legacies, others struggle to reconcile them with the deep scars left by centuries of exploitation. But it's not just in the buildings or the language that the empire's imprint can be felt. The British identity itself is deeply interwoven with the legacy of empire. Britain's global connections, its relationships with former colonies, and its influence on world events continue to be shaped by the empire's vast web of trade, diplomacy, and conflict. Commonwealth countries, though no longer under British control, remain significant to Britain's identity. From India to Canada, from Australia to South Africa, the ties of history continue to bind these nations together. The political and cultural exchanges that happen today are a direct continuation of the network Britain established during its imperial heyday. Yet, this connection is not without its tensions. While Britain often views its past through a lens of nostalgia or pride in the accomplishments of empire, many of the former colonies view it with a mixture of resentment and rejection. The enduring legacy of colonialism, with its legacies of economic disparity, racial inequality, and cultural assimilation, continues to stir debates within Britain and abroad. The Black Lives Matter movement and the growing calls for reparations for the descendants of enslaved Africans are just some of the modern-day manifestations of this unresolved tension. Britain's empire may be gone, but the moral complexities of its legacy are far from settled. In the post-imperial age, Britain is no longer the unassailable global power it once was. Its empire has been dismantled, and its borders are no longer defined by the vast colonies that stretched across continents. Yet, the remnants of empire still linger. The structures of power, the political systems, and the global trade networks Britain once controlled have all been reshaped by history, but they continue to be influenced by its imperial past. The country's role on the world stage has shifted, but its history is always present, casting a long shadow over its modern identity. The rise of new powers, especially in the East, has shifted the balance of global influence. But Britain's historical connections to its former colonies still provide it with a unique role in international affairs. Whether it's through trade agreements, diplomatic ties, or cultural exchanges, Britain's imperial past continues to inform its foreign policy and its relationships with the rest of the world. The Commonwealth, though far removed from the days of imperial control, remains a significant part of Britain's post-imperial identity, functioning as a reminder of both the glories and the failures of empire. But beyond the global stage, Britain's imperial past is woven into the very fabric of its national psyche. In the streets, in the schools, in the media, the legacy of empire still lingers. For some, it represents a time of great power and prestige, while for others, it's a painful reminder of exploitation, oppression, and the struggles for independence that followed. In recent years, the country has seen increased debates around statues, monuments, and the celebration of historical figures who were key architects of empire. The question of how Britain should reckon with its colonial past remains a topic of national discourse, one that is still being navigated and defined by both the public and the political elite. As Britain looks toward the future, its history remains an indelible part of its identity. Modern Britain, though no longer an empire, still grapples with the legacy of empire's glory and shame. It finds itself at a crossroads, seeking to redefine its place in a world that is no longer centered around European powers. The rise of new global players, the shift to a multipolar world, and the continued reconfiguration of global systems all pose challenges to Britain as it seeks to move forward. But in this journey of reinvention, Britain cannot escape its past. No nation can ever truly escape its imperial history. The world is changing, but the legacy of empire will continue to echo throughout history. For Britain, the aftermath of empire is not just a thing of the past. It's part of the very fabric of its modern identity, shaping its politics, its relationships, and its global standing in ways both explicit and hidden. Though the empire has fallen, its echoes still reverberate across the globe. As Britain moves forward, the question remains, can a nation ever truly escape its imperial past? Thank you for watching this story until the end. If you found this one captivating, you're in for a treat with the next one. It's just as fascinating, if not more, than you could ever imagine. Don't miss out. Click on the image on your screen now to dive into the next adventure.